Vanessa, can you still hear me? I've lost sound.
Anything from McDonald's.
Pizza.
Braaivleis.
Sweets. Oh, I love sweets.
A burger, chocolates.
Pizza is probably my favorite meal.
I visit the kiosk about once in every 2 days at least, but maybe more. It depends on my money.
Most of the time when I'm studying, I need to snack, and if I can't concentrate, I'm gonna go get a snack.
Oh yes, I get so hungry, I get hangry, I get hungry, angry, and then I can't work at all.
I really need my snacks to help me maintain my focus.
Sometimes I really suffer from headaches, like if I don't have a meal within the next 3 to 4 hours.
Good day, and thank you for joining us for today's live stream. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a large impact on populations globally. We could spend much time just discussing this topic. However, today the discussion will focus on the treatment of the SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, and specifically the use of ivermectin, which has brought with it a lot of controversy. My name is Professor Vanessa Steenkamp. I am currently Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Pretoria. My research is focused on drug development. I currently hold the executive role as the President of the South African Society of Basic and Clinical Pharmacology and am the Vice President of the Toxicology Society of South Africa. To help us understand today's topic better and answer the questions you may have on ivermectin, I am joined by two experts, Professor Vinnie Naidoo and Professor Natalie Shellack. Professor Naidoo is the Dean of the Faculty of Veterinary Science of the University of Pretoria and is a veterinarian and a specialist veterinary pharmacologist. His research expertise involves translational animal research, with focus on new pharmaceutical products development, pharmacokinetic evaluations of drug effect, and preclinical toxicology. Our second speaker, Professor Shellack, is a registered pharmacist and currently holds the position of Head of the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Health Sciences. She serves on the Gauteng Provincial Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee and is a member of the Tertiary and Quaternary Expert Review Committee for the National Department of Health. Welcome, Professor Naidoo and Professor Shellack, and thank you for joining us today. Before we start with the discussion, a reminder to post your questions and remarks in the comments section that we will address towards the end of the discussion. I'd like to start off with asking Professor Naidoo, what is the origin of this drug and its intended use?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the question. So, ivermectin has been a veterinary drug since the 80s. It is a fermentation product, so it's a natural compound, and has been found to be extremely effective against the management of parasites in animals, and also against external parasites in animals. Since its discovery and its effect, it's expanded to use in almost all animal species And its use in animals actually also predates its use in people. But all in all, it remains one of the most effective antiparasitic drugs we have on the veterinary market.
Thank you very much, Professor Sherlock. Could you elaborate on the human usage thereof?
Yes, and good afternoon, everyone. So, as Prof. Naidu explained, ivermectin was discovered in 1967, interestingly enough, on a golf course. And its uses in humans includes endo and ectoparasites, nematodes, filarial infections, malaria, and then infections of the gastrointestinal tract.
Now, as pharmacologists, we are aware that it is important that the drug hits the target of treatment. What is the drug target for the treatment of SARS-CoV-2, Prof. Sherlock?
Yes, so interesting, the ivermectin's antiviral properties was discovered in 2012. And what it does is it acts on RNA viruses. And these RNA viruses, it actually inhibits the incorporation of the viral RNA into the host cytoplasm and into important alpha and beta. So then essentially it actually prevents viral replication. And this is some of the data that we have from some in vitro studies.
Okay, so that is exactly what I was going to ask you. Has it been proven to do so, in vitro, in vivo?
Yes. Okay. So that is actually where it all started. Is there was an Australian study published in 2020 by Kaylee and her colleagues, and what they've shown is that if you have constant exposure of ivermectin in in vitro environment, so in other words, in a laboratory in cell cultures, at a certain constant concentration, then they could see a reduction in viral replication by nearly 90%. But what is important is in your, just to answer some of the in vivo questions, is ivermectin, as we've now illustrated, is actually such a complex compound. So translating that information from a one compartment in vitro model to a complex human compartment, the evidence has not been overwhelming, and we do not have conclusive evidence that it really does have the same sorts of effects in vivo, in other words, in a human, for COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Is it essential, it is essential that a drug is efficacious and safe for use. Now, with safe, it is implied that it is not harmful or toxic, nor that it results in any adverse events. Now, as Paracelsus, the father of toxicology, said, poison is in everything, and no thing is without poison. The dosage makes it either a poison or a remedy. Now, Professor Naidu, what is the recommended dosage for livestock as antiparasitic treatment?
So the drug is used at a very low dose of 200 micrograms per kg. So you're looking at a very small dose having an effect. And it's actually beneficial because you don't want to be holding a large syringe trying to inject a large animal of 500 kgs. So it's very concentrated and very effective at that concentration.
And what is the recommended doses then for humans? And does it differ depending on the severity of the disease, Prof. Sherlock?
Does. So some of the clinical trials that we do have was around about 200 to 300 micrograms per kg, and then in some specific pharmacokinetic studies, they looked at 30 and 60 milligrams over a course of 3 to 5 days. But what is important about ivermectin, and for the indication that we want to use it if we're looking at COVID-19, is you want to inhibit viral replication. And as I've said earlier, you need an effective concentration to inhibit the viral replication. So ivermectin is a very lipophilic compound. So it has to be metabolized by the hepatic system. So if you have too much of that drug in your system, the potential of it then missing the target, in other words, what we are looking for viral replication, and then actually crossing the blood-brain barrier, normally at those dosages it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. But what one must remember is that COVID is a hyperinflammatory condition. So in a hyperinflammatory condition, the blood-brain barrier doesn't really respond as it does in another person. And then ivermectin, being a lipophilic compound, can cross over and then exert some of the effects that it does in animals, that we're using it as a parasite, as a nematicidal or an endo and ectoparasiticide, where it can actually work on the GABA receptors. So it does, yes.
Okay, so at what point does ivermectin then become lethal to humans?
So actually, when they looked at some of these studies, and remember I'm talking about normal first phase studies, 10 to 100 times the dose was more or less seen to be safe. But what is happening currently in a condition such as COVID, and I've discussed it now earlier, the body is in a hyperinflammatory state, in a cytokine storm. So then your potential to become toxic can be at a lower dose. And then what I also want to highlight is in South Africa, we have a very large population. We have the largest rollout of antiretrovirals. And because it's such a lipophilic compound, it's metabolized in the hepatic system, in cytochrome P, 450, where a lot of our antiretrovirals, for example, lopinavir and ritonavir, is also being metabolized. So it is the side effects that we are worried about, but we are also worried about all of the other drug interactions when we are using this drug outside of its intended and studied uses.
You've touched on the side effects, mentioning of the side effects. What are the short and long-term side effects that are expected to be seen?
So some of the short-term side effects is what we normally see. It's lethargy, tiredness, a little bit of nausea and vomiting because of its effects in the gastrointestinal tract. If it is used for infections of the eye, then you have a lot of irritation in the eye. And then at larger dosages, of course, what you will see is some hepatotoxicity because of its metabolism, and then vomiting and dizziness, or some of the things that you have to look out for.
Thank you. Professor Naidu, I could maybe ask you, in animals, are there any known side effects there that, or are they similar to what we see in humans?
So most definitely you will see side effects. The side effects are similar in people. However, we have a vast interspecies difference. So as an example, certain dog breeds don't have blood-brain barrier pumps, and you can have high concentration of drugs reaching the brain. And in these animals, at the normal recommended dose, they will slip into a coma, and a lot of them die. So that's the most serious side effect of the drug. It is targeting the GABA system as in people, and it's actually the same system as the parasite, and that's how you have an antiparasitic effect. So the drug is not necessarily safe in mammals, it's just safe because it doesn't get to the brain. And that is what's important. And as mentioned, when you have a hyperinflammatory condition, you can get accumulation in the brain and you end up with more side effects.
Thank you. And that is the important difference that we should note. Now, on the 4th of March this year, a paper was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where a randomized clinical trial was conducted to determine the effect of ivermectin on time to resolution of symptoms in adults with mild COVID-19. The authors concluded that a 5-day course of ivermectin compared to placebo did not significantly improve the time to resolution of the symptoms. So, Professor Naidu, what would your comment be on this?
So I wasn't surprised by the finding at all. So if you had to look at the amount of drug you need to have an effect based on the cell culture study mentioned earlier, and the ability of the drug to get into a person or an animal, you just never achieve those high concentrations in the lung for high enough time. So it's not a case of whether the drug works, it's whether you can get the drug to where it needs to work. And in this case, I really doubt that ivermectin reaches effective concentrations.
Thank you very much. Professor Schillig, would you like to add anything?
Yes, so that study is maybe one of another 16 clinical trials that's been conducted and is currently posted on the WHO's website. What one must remember is that within COVID-19, there's also a lot of other drugs that are being used and a lot of other comorbid conditions that are being investigated. So when looking at ivermectin, it's really difficult to have a homogeneous population. In other words, to look if it's really the ivermectin that's making the difference. And when they looked at some of the hard study endpoints, in other words, hospital stay, a reduction in mechanical ventilation, a reduction in morbidity and mortality, there wasn't enough conclusive, or the evidence wasn't conclusive or statistically significant to say that, you know, we've got enough evidence to say that we should use ivermectin for a patient diagnosed with COVID-19. And as mentioned by Prof. Naidu, when you look at this molecule, this very lipophilic molecule, it doesn't cross the lung tissue that, you know, or that easily. In fact, when they looked at the dosage of 200 micrograms per kg, only 100 nanograms, when they looked at it in calf, you know, in a calf's lung sample, reached the lung epithelial cells. So even in looking at some of the other in vitro studies in more complex animal models, or in vitro studies in animal models, we could not see that if you don't maintain that concentration that Cayley et al. Reached in that simple one compartment model, you won't necessarily see those effects. So some of the studies have looked at different formulations, for example, nanoparticles, to formulate it so that you have that constant exposure. So what I do think is important for the, you know, for everyone listening out there is to remember that yes, we've seen a signal. We've seen that signal, yes. But we don't have the formulations at the moment, and we're not completely sure if we have a hyperinflammatory condition, if we will see those effects in the formulations and dosages available.
You're speaking about the dosages and the formulations. What is the risk of dispensing ivermectin?
Okay, so if you just use, so from a dispenser's point of view, we will get to the legal aspects a little later, but from a user's point of view, if it's not being prescribed to you at a dose, if no one knows what comorbid conditions we have, if we don't have the correct drug formulation, sometimes one have to consider that you might be taking only side effects rather than the effects if we don't know if we are using the correct drugs. So we really do need more clinical trials, and currently the WHO's stance on ivermectin use is also only in clinical trials, which is a really controlled environment.
You spoke about the legal aspects. Now, ivermectin has not only attracted interest in the global scientific community, but also among policymakers. What does the High Court ruling mean for the crossover between veterinary medicine usage and the use in human medicine going forward? Professor Naidu?
So it's an interesting question you raise. So I must point out that firstly, ivermectin for veterinary use is actually not a veterinary medicine. Veterinary medicines are registered with the Department of Health with SAPRA for use by veterinarians. This product is actually registered with the Department of Agriculture as a stock remedy. The Stock Remedy Act only allows the use of this product in animals. It cannot be used in people. And the ruling of the High Court was only binding on the medical formulations. So the veterinary formulations or stock remedies are still restricted for use in animals. They're not to be used legally on people.
Professor Sherlock, would you like to add to that?
Yes, so all medicines and medical devices are regulated under the Medicine Act 101 of 1965. And actually, ivermectin has been a Schedule 3 substance since 1987. So we actually have it on our regulatory body for 30 years now. However, what one has to stress is, and I think that's what the ruling actually implies, is that if you want to register a drug under that act, then you have to actually then you have to gazette it under the government gazette according to Regulation 14. And then anyone who wants to register it for a particular indication can then actually say, I want to register it for that indication, and then it's registered at the SAPRA, at the regulatory body. So what has happened is that step, Section 14, has not happened. So it's available under the Schedule 3 substance, but it is registered in South Africa since the 14th of March of this year for pustular rosea, so papulopustular rosea, which is actually a skin condition. So it's not registered for COVID, although it is available under Schedule 3.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to look at a few of the questions that are coming in from our listeners. There are quite a few. Professor Sherlock, the first one is to you. Are you aware of any clinical trials being undertaken in South Africa for the treatment or for uses as prophylaxis?
Okay, so the University of the Free State has actually indicated, Farmkos, that they are going to undertake a clinical trial and then look at the clinical indications of ivermectin in COVID-19. Other than that, I'm not familiar with any other clinical trials apart from usage data studies or, repurposed drug studies. But I know the University of the Free State will investigate that in a South African population, which is really good for our country.
Another question that we've received is if ivermectin works against COVID-19, what are the methods of action to be implemented for its use?
Okay, so the methods of action, so the mode of administration, I would first off by saying that, one would look at an oral capsule or a tablet, and then it would be important to have that as part of a nanoparticle because we really do need that sustained release of the drug, which I know some countries are looking at. So the methods of actions to be implemented, if we want to look at it from a pharmacovigilance point of view, I think once we, institute this drug maybe on a large scale, it would be important to have pharmacovigilance activities, work with the regulatory body, to know that when we are using it, what is our safety and efficacy in our country. And as I've mentioned before, especially with other drugs like the antiretrovirals or even warfarin.
Okay, another question is, does using it for COVID-19 cause an increase in parasite resistance of the drug? Professor Naidu, could you maybe answer that?
So it's once again an interesting question. So at the moment, no, but definitely with increased use, you will see resistance developing. Antivirals are developing resistance like your antimicrobials. So there's no doubt that with overuse, you likely will see some decline in the efficacy of the product. But once again, the debate now is at a high level of concentration need for that effect. You first need to reach that level as well. So it's a bit of a two-step question.
Yes, definitely. I think, not everything is that straightforward. There is another question on what are the most common adverse reactions or events. I think we've answered that slightly. You could maybe just reiterate the comments because it is a question that has come from the audience now.
Mostly what we will see at the registered indications at the moment is really a headache, nausea, vomiting. If you are treating gastrointestinal infections, because you have some localized infection, you will have some, some gastrointestinal diarrhea, maybe vomiting. And then if it's used for eyes, then you'll have some localized infections. And then over a longer period of time, if someone already has hepatic impairment, then your likelihood for hepatotoxicity, a jaundice type of picture, etc., may present.
Thank you. And can prophylactic use of ivermectin decrease your chances of contracting COVID-19?
Oh, what a great question. There's been pockets of countries in the world that's rolled out ivermectin for the reduction in, COVID-19, and we really haven't seen any conclusive evidence for that. And it is really difficult to gather conclusive evidence in a large population. Some countries, some South American countries have reported great success, but some of the methodology in those studies has been questionable, and that's why the rest of the world has not adopted that practice.
Yeah, so leading on from this, one of the other questions was, and we've just spoken about the prophylactic use of it, but when should we then use ivermectin?
So currently the recommendation for ivermectin use is within a very controlled environment. So in a clinical trial environment, if you want to enroll in some of the studies available. But we really just don't have the evidence for everyday use, either prophylaxis or indication in our country and with our population. And then, of course, for endo and ectoparasitic use, nematocidal, filariasis infections, or for river blindness, for those indications.
And is this drug available in our hospitals?
So at the moment, under Act 101 of 1965, a dispenser or a pharmacist, which is a pharmacist or anyone holding a dispensing license, can have it available if for those specific indications or on compassionate use. still under Section 21 for those indications. So it could be available in pharmacies and in hospitals, but then again for those under those specific rules and regulations as guided by the Act and the recent finding from the High Court on the 5th of April. Yes.
Okay, another question has just come in. Are there any promising local clinical trial results on ivermectin as a SARS-CoV-2 inhibitor?
Just a study that we know of locally. The study it started, as we've heard from the University of the Free State. But other than that, I'm not aware of any local clinical trials. Internationally, on the WHO's website, there's a really great page if anyone wants to go and look at that. And then from the FDA, there's a register for clinical trials on the FDA that you can go and follow to see what studies have delivered, and what results we've seen.
Have you engaged with any frontline practitioners that have treated COVID-19 patients with ivermectin?
So yes, we've, in our practice, it's just like in the general practice. You've seen with this large lawsuit, there's been a great division in the scientific community. Once the paper from Kaylee et al. And her colleagues in Australia has been published. And some of the doctors and, colleagues are really open and are hopeful because of the signal. And that's not only for people that I've engaged with, it's globally, it's the drug that has caused, I would say, the biggest division in scientists. So there are really practitioners that have seen that it has great promise and that when they use it, they see a turnaround. But with a condition such as SARS-CoV-2, and because of all of the other contributing drugs and factors and some of the pharmacogenetic underlying conditions, we really don't know if that turnaround is just simply on ivermectin, or is it because of everything else and the patient's underlying condition.
Well, leading on from that, one of the listeners is saying, if I have an autoimmune illness and I had to use ivermectin, how dangerous could it be?
So yes, also an important question. With autoimmune conditions, because you've got this upregulated immune response that eventually then leads to a downregulated immune response as the body is almost fighting itself. The use of ivermectin, if it's not for an indication, an endo and an ectoparasite, and we just use it, could have untoward effects, especially if the hepatic system is already impaired. Then it could place you at a risk, but no more than any other drug in its class if it's used outside of its indications. But it doesn't have a specific indication or effect on the immune system apart from its effects on the viral system. And of course, in a hyperinflammatory syndrome, the blood-brain barrier then also comes to play.
Thank you very much. Now, current scientific evidence on the efficacy of ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19 remains equivocal. In closing, what would your recommendation be to the public on the use of ivermectin? Professor Naidu?
So the question I've been getting most often is, can I buy veterinary ivermectin because it's readily available and put myself on it? And my answer remains absolutely not. We don't know anything about these formulations in people. To take a drug in which we know absolutely nothing about is unsafe. If you are to be on ivermectin, rely on medical advice and have a doctor prescribe it, and make sure that you're in a case where you can be monitored because the side effects can be nasty.
Professor Schillock, would you like to add anything?
Yes, my advice to the public, and in accordance with what Prof. Naidu has put so eloquently, is that one should be wary of drugs or just be careful if we don't have enough clinical evidence that really could guide us towards the usage. And yes, we do have a signal, and we understand that people are really scared of what is currently happening. But you must remember, if you are not sure of the dose, and especially remember the multi-compartment model, also ask yourself the question, if we don't know the dose, and we're not completely sure of the kinetics and dynamics, are we not only administering side effects on top of a disease that is already hyperinflammatory?
Thank you very much. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Naidoo and Professor Schillick for sharing their knowledge with us pertaining to the use of ivermectin in treating COVID-19 and the future of research in this area. Thank you to the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Pretoria for affording us this platform to empower each other with factual information. And finally, thank you to our viewers for watching. We trust this has been an informative session. Be sure to follow us and subscribe to all our social media platforms, such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, to stay up to date with research findings as well as interesting developments in the field of health sciences. Please stay safe and remember that your health is in your hands.
At the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Health Sciences, we believe in unearthing potential. We believe in our students' potential to make a positive impact in society and to produce research that shifts boundaries. In order to help students reach their full potential, the Faculty of Health Sciences has established the Life Changers Fund. Partner with us to help our life changers reach their full potential by contributing to the Student Solidarity Fund. Your contribution will help support students who are in need to pay for accommodation, tuition, food, and procure PPE. Join us and help support our students to reach their full potential. Through any contribution, you can be a life changer too. Developing life changers together.